You're listening to the Hello World Podcast, number 47. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. On today's show, we have Steve Smith. Steve is an entrepreneur and software developer with a passion for building quality software as effectively as possible. He is currently the Chief Technology Officer at Falafel Software. Steve has published several courses on Pluralsight covering DDD, Solid, design patterns, and software architecture. He is a Microsoft Regional Director and an MVP, a frequent speaker at developer conferences, an author, and a trainer. Along with his wife and business partner, Michelle Smith, Steve is also the founder of Lake Quincy Media, which was acquired by the Code Project, and NimblePros, which was acquired by Telerik. Steve's an ex-Army engineer officer and an Iraq veteran who enjoys playing games and spending time outdoors. Steve and I have an interesting conversation today as we talk about his experience in creating businesses and also the experience of having them acquired not once but twice. He's also an advocate for code quality, and certainly that comes out in his story. Let's take a listen. Well, this is great. Today I have Steve Smith with me. How are you doing, Steve?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm good. This is actually our second attempt at doing the show. We had a bad attempt when I was in the bowels of Istanbul.
Yeah, that's all right, though. It's good to have a dress rehearsal.
Yeah. So,
where are you now?
I'm in Vienna. So
awesome. I love Vienna.
It's a lovely town. I learned something when I got here that I feel like I should have known before. It's when I admitted it to my friends, I was like, I don't know how I didn't know this. When I lived over here years ago, I always knew that Vienna in German was spelled W-E-I-N. And so, of course, people that live here... I'm sorry, yes, W-I-E-N. I knew I was going to screw that up. And people that live here, there's like magazines, sort of like you'll find American Magazine. They have magazines over here for people that live here, and they're called, wieners. So I never put the connection of, Austrian sausages and what we call wieners, or what we called in wieners at high school, which is a whole different thing. But that there was this connection with Vienna at all. It was a little embarrassing.
Now you've figured it out. Now you've got all that straight in your mind.
I hope so. I mean, I knew about, Frankfurter and hamburgers and, all those sort of stealing of those things. I don't know why I didn't assume that there would be a one for wiener as well. Anything in a...
Don't forget Berliners.
That's true. The famous donut. Or whatever they are. I think they're more like beignets than donuts, but I'm not sure. So, of course, on this show, we want to find out how you got started. Were you writing software in the womb, or how did it exactly start?
I think I got started when I was maybe 7 years old, 8 years old, something like that.
Oh, nice.
When my father brought home an Apple II Plus computer. So whatever year the Apple II Plus came out, it was probably like early 80s is when I got my start. And we did a little bit of basic programming.
And was that Apple Basic on the Apple II? I don't remember. Yes.
And it was pretty much the only basic that I did for quite some time until I learned Visual Basic years later.
Oh, really?
But it was, you have to type in the line number for each line and, print things and go to here and that kind of programming.
Nice. Yeah,
you had to learn to put the lines like 10, 20, 30, 40, so you left yourself some room to put in new line numbers.
I hear that you can actually do this in Visual Basic as well, still.
I have heard that too, although I've never seen anyone do it with the line numbers.
Now I'm tempted to try. And so, were you programming games and those sorts of things for yourself, or what were you doing with Apple
pretty
Basic?
Much. My dad and I would get magazines, and they would have games in them that you would type in because they didn't ship with CDs, or you couldn't download anything from anywhere. So you pretty much had an article with a big figure in it that was like, here, type in this to get this cool output. And so we would, and we'd do that. And then a few years later, we would play sort of text-based adventure games. The one I remember we played a lot was called Emon, like Eamon.
Oh, really?
And it was a, go north, pick up the thing on the ground, attack the thing that's attacking you with the sword, and that sort of thing.
And was this a precursor to Zork, or was this after Zork?
It was a precursor, I would say. It was Apple II Plus, so it was really early days.
Wow.
And then there was another game called Space War that had 2 spaceships that looked surprisingly like an X-Wing and a TIE fighter, but I don't think they had any such rights. And you would fly around and shoot at each other in that game. So
you both be on the keyboard at the same time? Is that how that worked?
Yeah, you'd each have like 3 keys that were telling you like
left,
maybe
right,
4,
and
like
forward.
Left, right, thrust, and shoot.
Oh, nice.
And yeah, it was like that was one of the few multiplayer games we had, so we played that a fair bit.
Wow.
Either my dad and I or me and my friends.
And that gave you the whole start. Did you know that this is what you wanted to do, or did you kind of fall into it?
Well, that's an interesting story because I always was interested in computers growing up, but I didn't ever think that it would be my career because I was also very interested in science. And especially through high school, I really fell in love with physics. Nice. And so I planned on majoring in physics in college. And so I graduated high school, got a scholarship to go to the University of Chicago, and it was with the Air Force. It was an Air Force ROTC scholarship.
Oh. And
the Air Force didn't really need anybody with a bachelor's degree in physics, so they told me I had to major in mathematics or computer science. And I said, well, that's fine. I'll just double major in physics too.
Right.
And I chose computer science because I, liked computers and I'd been programming. I took some programming classes even in high school when they were first being offered, and I'd always enjoyed it. So it seemed like a good fit.
Sounds better than majoring in math at that time, probably.
Yeah. I mean, I had to take a lot of math anyway, as it turned out, through college. But I mean, I probably could have got them minor something in math, but I was happy with the computer science degree.
Nice. And you stayed through University of Chicago the whole time?
Unfortunately, I did not. I actually only was there for 1 quarter because that same Air Force scholarship that was giving me a full ride to the University of Chicago, which is not a cheap school. I think these days it's like over $50K a year.
Wow.
And back then it was probably half that, but it was still way, way more than my family could afford.
Sure.
So the Air Force ended up never paying them a cent because I had a knee injury my sophomore year in high school playing soccer and had healed up just fine. But they had said, oh, well, since you had this prior existing knee injury, we need you to get, this paperwork and this waiver. And so I tried to do some of those things, but they didn't even let me know about it until I'd started at school. And by the time I was trying to go through that process, I was already getting collection notices from the university because they hadn't gotten their money. And I was like, it was not a happy time. I ended up having to leave and owed the university like $7,000 that took me years to pay off because I didn't have any real job for quite some time. So, and ultimately I ended up going to Ohio State, which is a much less expensive university.
And you live in Ohio or Indiana?
Yeah, I live in Kent, Ohio.
Oh, right.
Not too far from Cleveland. Ohio State's down in Columbus. It's about 2 hours away.
Yeah. My sister's actually has lived in Columbus for the last few years.
Oh, nice.
To know that a little.
Yeah, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law both live down there now.
Nice. It's a lovely little town. And so you went to this new school and you stayed in computer science even though you didn't have to?
Yes. I kept with the same plan that I would just double major. And so went through the first year taking physics and computer science courses. And once I was done with that, I started the second year and I took like physics 210 or whatever it was for the second year of physics. And, it just got really hard. And, they'd assign you like 3 problems to do and it would take 3 hours to do 3 problems.
Wow.
Whereas the comp sci stuff was, you'd be doing labs and they would take, more hours than that, but you kind of expected that and you could work, in the lab with your friends and, it was more enjoyable. So, and ultimately not as difficult. And at the time with the .com, I guess it's a little bit before the .com boom, but still with the internet just barely starting at that point, you could kind of see the writing on the wall that computer science was going to be a decent career path. So, and I knew physics wasn't going to take me anywhere without lots of graduate school. So I went to just the computer science route at that point.
Nice. And were you, other than like school projects, were you doing any side work or anything like that? I mean, that seems to be pretty common with comp sci students.
Yeah, I didn't too much in school. I did a little bit. Like toward the end, I actually wrote a CGI script, an early web page that would do the student council voting for Ohio State University.
Oh, nice.
And that was like my first web app that I wrote using Perl and CGI Bin. And it was not all that sophisticated, but it did allow students to, register and vote for their student council elected positions.
And you're still supporting that Perl code, is that correct?
No. I don't think it lived very long. I'm pretty sure it got replaced a year or two later. So.
That's funny. So did you find a job right out of college then?
Yeah, I did have so I worked through college because it turned out since I was a transfer student, I didn't have any financial aid or scholarships, even though I would have had if I'd just gone to Ohio State from the get-go.
Yeah.
So I ended up having to work quite a bit, and I had two jobs that were great. One was a computer lab monitor job where basically we got paid to sit in the computer science labs and help anyone that had a question with their lab work. And, they would tell us, hey, don't, give them the answer, but, help them if they're stuck. And that was nice because it was in the same building as all my classes. So I could just fit it in an hour here and there throughout the day, and I didn't have to drive someplace to go to work. And it helped me, just have time to work on stuff and, learn more programming and get to know the faculty and
nice.
And also play some games and stuff. But it was a good job. And then my last quarter, I had an internship for a company that's like a branch of OCLC, the Online Computing Center, down in like Dayton, Ohio. And they have a branch company called Information Dimensions that's in Columbus, and I worked for them for I don't know, like 3 or 4 months, just as I was getting ready to graduate. And that was my first like real programming work in another company. And I didn't get a whole lot out of that because it was pretty much just really boring old code that I was fixing bugs in. But the person sitting in the cube across the way from me was just sitting down and learning this new thing called active server pages and was, going on and on about how cool it was. And so whenever I'd get bored with the stuff I was doing, I would go over and see what he was working on. And that was my first introduction to ASP, which I ended up really liking.
And spending a lot of time in, I assume. I mean, and just so people listening are clear about this, you're talking about pre.NET ASP. You're talking about the original active server pages, VB script or JScript.
Yes, exactly.
And all that.
This was probably pre-ASP 3.0, which was the last version of ASP there was, what we call classic ASP now. or I guess that's what we called it when .NET first came out. Probably now we would only call it legacy ASP. But,
I think so, because I've now heard the term thrown out that makes me feel very old, legacy ASP.NET, which
yes. Yes.
Wow, makes me feel really old. But
things become classic for a little while, and then they turn into legacy. And then there's probably something after legacy. It's probably just dead.
Yeah, COBOL. Yeah. And so, was this a core of what you did for quite a while? Was the active server pages?
It was. My first job. I graduated from college in '97, and had a few different offers, and ended up working at a consulting company. And I chose a consulting company specifically because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I wanted to see how different companies built software and what kinds of different things different companies did. And so at a consulting company, I figured I'd get to move around and see a lot of different techniques and practices and projects and workplaces and just different ways of doing things. And I was very lucky that my very first position was with the Limited in Columbus. They own Structure and Abercrombie Fitch and Victoria's Secret.
Retail stores in malls usually for young
mostly clothing,
girls,
things like that. And guys. I think Abercrombie's a guy and Structure's definitely a guy.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
I was a little bit...
made me surprised. I don't shop at the Limited as much as you might imagine. So
yeah, no, me neither. But I was disappointed. I worked. They have a huge campus in a bunch of different buildings, and so some of my friends at the same consulting company actually worked for Victoria's Secret or Victoria's Secret catalog in that building, and so they would have all over the walls and things like the models plastered up and things, stuff that would normally get you in trouble for having up in your cubicle at work. was just like on
Encouraged.
14-foot tall posters everywhere. But I worked in the same building as Structure, and Structure is like a men's store. So we had the same thing, but it was all, topless male models everywhere, and they'd have photo shoots and stuff, and it'd be all male guys. I'm like, man, I wish I was at the Victoria's Secret room.
I'm at the wrong building.
But it was an awesome opportunity because right around that same time, the team that I was consulting with, they needed me to build this application, and I ended up doing it pretty much all by myself with a little bit of guidance from them because their entire team was tasked with doing Y2K fixes.
Ouch.
And so they had no slack for anything other than just going through all of their existing code and trying to make sure that it was going to be compliant when the doomsday of the year 2000 bug reared its ugly head in a couple of years. And so I had the opportunity to kind of evaluate a few different solutions, and I barely even remember what other choices there were, but I did, look at a few different options before deciding that I wanted to try active server pages for this project. And then I built that project over the next 9 months or so for the limited.
Now, were you building the markup in the front as well as all the back-end server code?
Yeah, I was doing everything soup to nuts because they didn't have anyone to help. I was even doing the database side of things, which was something that started with an I, but it's been so long I don't remember what the database was. But certainly wasn't SQL Server back in 1997.
Probably Ingress or something like that.
Yeah, Ingress is what came to mind, but that's a Google game now. Was that a database?
That was a database. Years and years and years ago. Probably still is a database. There's probably 4 guys in a basement someplace still,
right,
advocating it. But there was that period before, SQL Server, Oracle, and DB2 just kicked everybody out. That they're sort of like we are today with NoSQL, where there's a ton of players, and
right.
Some of them got consumed, some of them disappeared. Yeah. So, and Ingress was one that I touched, I think, for an afternoon once, years and years and years ago. So, of course, someone will probably reply to this and tell me, no, you have that completely wrong. It is just a Google game, but I'm pretty sure I'm right.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know that was the one in any case, but it was a database that I had to learn. And I remember I didn't learn a lot about databases in college. I had like one course. So I learned a lot about databases from my manager at the Limited in that first client engagement. And then I did end up at Ohio State going and joining the Army ROTC program and the Army National Guard, in part to pay for school and in part to serve my country and stay in shape and help out Ohio if it ever got a blizzard or a flood.
Sure.
And so that relates to this because I finished this project for the Limited like on June 24th or something of 2008. 9 months after it started there, and like that Monday, I had to report to my officer training course for 4 months in Missouri. So it was really nice. I remember when I was done with that project because I was like, I'm done. If there's any bugs, if there's anything else, they're not calling me because I'm gone. So that was a good feeling too.
There is a satisfaction in that, but I'm sure there were no bugs, right?
They never called me, so I assume it always worked fine.
And when you were doing this, you said you learned a lot about databases from the boss. What is that experience like, especially as a consultant, where you're trying to learn new skills? I mean, because some people think that when they go and become a consultant or a contractor or whatever the word is, that they're supposed to have the full quiver of tools in with them, and asking questions on a job scares some guys. Was this something that never occurred to you, or was this something that was sort of instilled to you by the guys you worked with?
I am always trying to learn things. And so I have for a long time, I don't know if it's confidence or stupidity, but I'm happy to ask questions when I don't know something because I know that's how I'm going to learn. And so sometimes I'll ask and I will look stupid because it's something I should have known, but I'd rather do that than not ask. And probably the only exception to that is on like a sales call or something like that, where I know I should just keep my mouth shut. But once I'm there to do a job, if there's a question I need to ask in order to do my job better, I will ask that question. And I think that is a good skill for everybody to have.
Absolutely.
Because if you don't ask the question, you're just wasting everybody's time anyway. So and at that time we didn't have really Google. I mean, literally, I think this predated Google.
Right.
Or if Google existed, I didn't know about it. I think Alta Vista might have been around or something. But and so there wasn't a whole lot of other places to go to ask other than the people that were there around me.
Yeah.
And I didn't have any other consultants I was solo there. So I had a good relationship with my manager from the beginning, and I think a lot of that, depends on your relationship with your manager. If your manager has been sold a bill of goods that this person is an expert and they know everything there is to know about XYZ technology, and you don't, and you show up and it becomes very obvious when you ask, how do you write hello world in that technology? Well, then your salesperson or whoever set you up for failure.
Right.
But he knew that I was a new grad. He knew that I was, coming into this, doing stuff with ASP that, I'd never used before, but, I presented to him the options and why I thought it was the right choice. And he knew that I had minimal experience, and he was, I'm sure, paying a rate commensurate with that experience.
Of course.
So,
so
no, it was okay in my case, I think.
Well, and I think in many cases it ends up being okay. There's sometimes that spark of curiosity is hidden in developers because they're too afraid of looking like they don't know what they're doing. Where I think your attitude about asking when you need to learn, whether it ends up being a great or a stupid question. Most of the people I really admire are the ones who are willing to ask questions about everything. They never assume that they know everything. Even if they're an expert in the technology, I've heard people ask questions which I'm like, I thought you might know that. And he goes, well, I think I do, but let's see how, I'm interested in, this perspective or that perspective. So that sense of curiosity to me, I think, is so crucial to being a good developer that sometimes fear gets in the way, in certain developers' lives. And it sounds like that was never really an issue for you.
No, at least not at this client. I mean, I felt secure and safe in my relationship with that manager to have these conversations and because I would talk to him and I would say, okay, I understand what we need to build now, and here's how I want to model it on the database. And it would be a naive model because I didn't know what I was doing. And so he would say, okay, well, here, do you know what third normal form is? And I was like, no, I've never heard of that. And he, okay, well, here, he'd spend 15 minutes on a whiteboard and he kind of show me what that means. And I was like, oh, okay, I see why that's good. And then, he would, kind of show me how I could break apart the relationships and go from there. And so, it was that sort of thing where he was kind of helping me with my design because I was very inexperienced and I was writing the whole application from scratch. And so it ended up being a better application because of the time he spent mentoring me. And he still got the value out of, the application got written. So I think it was a win-win. Did
you learn that lesson to be on the other side of that taking, developers, your work that are working for you, like when you were running your companies, to take, to be able to mentor them as well on the investment in those people was worth it?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure I directly drew that conclusion because of that experience, although thinking back, maybe I did. But yeah, I've always believed in my own companies and organizations that it's oftentimes easier to play the long game and hire folks that are perhaps still in school as interns. See which ones have the spark, the curiosity and the passion to learn. And even though they don't necessarily know how to be, professional developers at that time, you can teach them all of that. You can't teach them to be passionate and curious and have that spark. And the nice thing is when you're getting them at that level where they haven't graduated yet or they've just graduated, they do not have this huge expectation of their value that, I've been doing this for 10 years, so I should be making $1 million type of thing. And they also don't have any habits that you need to unlearn from them or untrain them from doing, which is incredibly valuable as well. So,
absolutely.
So yeah, I definitely think that mentoring and like apprenticeship models work very well in our line of work.
And so in working with this consulting company, did you then move into your own company? Was that the next step?
Eventually, yeah. I stayed there for 5 years, and that led us through the .com bust in 2002. And so I think in 2001 is when the company really had issues, and they had 800 consultants total. Wow. And like several hundred of them were unassigned at one point during this phase, because when the economy has issues, the easiest thing for companies to cut is contractors and consultants. So they always take a hit. So the company I worked for, I really liked, but they had a buyout for the owners, where a capital company came in and did like a leveraged buyout, and the owners made out like fiends. They got a huge payday and they kept their jobs and their salaries. But the company, because of the way the buyout was done, the company took on the debt of paying for the purchase of the company.
Ouch.
Which is just crazy. And so all of a sudden we went from a nice healthy bottom line to, we've got a whole lot of debt and we have to pay it off with interest. And so a lot of perks and things that we had done kind of disappeared. Like, we can't really afford to go out and do a bowling night, and we aren't going to necessarily have all the snacks in the fridge all the time, and these little things that made it a fun place to be. And then right after that, they had layoffs where they laid off like 10% of the people, and that is bad for morale. But if you have to do it, you have to do it. But then the part that always struck me as like really a bad move on their part was, I think it was like 8 weeks after they did the layoffs, they announced that they were going to have like 8% across the board pay cuts for everyone that was left.
Ouch.
And that didn't make any sense to me. Like, if you knew you needed to lay people off, lay off enough so that everybody else is happy and healthy. But if you follow up layoffs with, not 2 months later, you do pay cuts, now you're basically just laying off all of your best people, because your best people can go find a job someplace else. And you've probably shaken their confidence now that you've just had these two events back to back.
Yeah.
So, they'll go find some other place that they can make what they were making or more and not be worried about getting laid off.
And then you end up with just the people in the middle. They cut either the guys that were making a lot of money or the guys that were making a little money, or at least weren't productive. And then the people that were afraid in the middle don't end up being especially the loss of mentorship. You end up with a somewhat dysfunctional group of developers.
Right. And that included me eventually. About a year after that is when I ultimately decided to leave. We had our first child, my daughter Ileana, in 2002, and part of the law says that you are allowed, with the Family Medical Leave Act, you can take up to 12 weeks unpaid, and so I did to see if we could make ends meet with me not working. And I should probably back up for a minute and say that while I was at the Limited, that first project in 1998, I started working on this little website called ASPalliance.com. And I didn't start that website. I didn't build it. I just discovered it. And it was a place that was offering a place to host your files if you would write articles for them. And so I did, because I wanted a place to store the things that I was learning about ASP.
Right.
And so I used it sort of like a blog, really, although no one knew that word at the time.
Right.
And it was just a place for me to put my notes from what I was learning, like how do you store a cookie using ASP? How do you output something that you can open up with Excel using ASP? And so I threw those on there for my own future reference, so that my next project I would just be able to look those up and see, if I needed those notes. But it turned out that other people really liked them too. And the person who owned ASPalliance.com ended up having me take it over, first as like just the running of it, and then ultimately ownership of it. And so a few years later, in early 2000s, advertising online was really taking off, and banners were making a lot of money. And so I started an ad consortium with about a dozen other ASP related websites. And so by 2002, when I was taking this time off from my full-time job, I was making a few $1,000s a month from the ad revenue from this ad consortium.
Very nice.
And so that's what I was spending my time on, was that, and also thinking about doing my own independent training and consulting. Again, because I had lost confidence in where I was working, and I wasn't even assigned at the time. I was on the bench anyway, so I was spending my time even at work not really doing anything terribly productive for my employer, because they weren't using all of their people on the bench for anything. They weren't building a product or anything like that. They would just have them come in and play games all day or study for a certification exam maybe.
Yeah.
So
which isn't all that useful. And so that was sort of you had the advertising company. Was that Lake Quincy?
It would eventually become Lake Quincy Media, yeah.
Yeah. And you also created the consultancy just after that, because after you left that company, that was the next step, right? Is to hire some guys and all that?
Not quite. I just went independent. We weren't quite ready for employees at that time.
Oh, nice.
So in 2002, I did end up leaving it, and it was like 5 years to the day that I'd been with that company, Software Architects. And after that, I started a company called ASP Smith Training. The website's still out there. If you go to aspsmith.com, it's a I Buy Spy portal demo website that hasn't been updated since like 2003 or something. But it's still there. And that was my site for training classes. And I taught an ASP.NET class, like a public class that I actually made a little bit of money on. And then I did some private training for some companies in the area, and that, paid pretty well, but it didn't have any residual. And that was what I was really happy with from the advertising business, was that, even if I decided to take a week off, the ad money kept coming in.
Right.
Whereas with training, it's, you get the money and then that's it. There's nothing else comes after that. So I was trying to strike a balance between the immediate cash flow to pay the bills and keep the household running, and then the ability to generate value beyond that had some long-term residual income.
And do you find that a lot of people you run into that are trying to go solo and such are thinking about both of those problems, or do you find that they're just looking for the next client?
I think so. I think most folks that have gone independent for any period of time understand and appreciate the notion of having something that makes money when you're not having to put in the hours yourself.
Right.
Because it's certainly nice to be able to say, well, I did this training class and I made X $1,000, or I'm independent and I'm able to charge this high rate. So if I can do that 40 hours a week for 2,000 hours a year, I make a whole lot of money. And isn't that great? Or even if I only work 8 months a year, and it takes me 4 months to do vacations and find work, I still make really good money, let's say. But that's all gone if you can't find work, or you get hurt, or whatever. You don't have anything you can sell. And that was always something that was interesting to me. I've always been very entrepreneurial. So the ability to build up a business that then you could sell, and even if it wasn't like, Facebook and you were getting billions, just the ability to sell a business and get a couple of years worth of money that business would have made in all at once, and then you can go be doing something else while you're getting that couple of years worth of money, is a great way to kind of jumpstart your earnings in your career. So that's ultimately what my wife and I ended up doing. We did the ASP Smith thing for a little while, but really the ASP Alliance ad agency was what was taking off. So I didn't do a whole lot more with the training. And really, I spent a lot of my time just building up the ad agency and doing sales for that. So in 2004, I ended up unexpectedly getting called up to go to Iraq, because I was still in the reserves with the Army National Guard.
Yeah.
And Michelle, my wife, who is a veterinarian by trade, so she got her veterinary degree in '99 and went to work in a local veterinary clinic in Northeast Ohio, near where we live. But she ended up leaving that practice in 2003, literally 9 months before I got called up to go to Iraq, to work full time on this ad business with me, because she'd been doing it in the evenings anyway, and it was just consuming all her time, because the vet clinic was a 6 day a week deal.
Yeah.
And then, with that additional work, and we had a new daughter who was, 1 at the time. And so, she wasn't getting to spend a lot of time with her. So she ended up not continuing work at the vet clinic, except she maintains her license and still practices a couple weeks a year. But, she went full time with ASP Alliance ad agency. I get called up. I go to Iraq for about 8 months or so, and she's able to run the business without me, which worked out, in hindsight well, because if she hadn't been doing it with me full time for 9 months, it would have been much more difficult for her to run everything.
Of course. And there is that moment when you think, oh, I guess I guess it doesn't need me at all.
I think she appreciated me when I came home.
I'm sure. For a variety of reasons, I assume.
But there are those who think, wow, Steve, you're so great that you were able to run that whole business from Iraq. And that's not at all the case. It was all Michelle, and I was pretty much not doing anything business or programming related while I was over there because I was otherwise occupied.
Of course.
But after I got home, that's when we decided, hey, let's really make this a real business. Let's hire some people. Let's get some office space. And so we started Lake Quincy Media in 2005, which we gave it the new name because the ASP Alliance ad network was a horrible name because ASP Alliance was one site in this ad network, and there were like 40 sites in the network. And so we would, every single time we had a new customer, they would ask us, so does this just run on ASP Alliance or does it run on all the sites? So we knew we needed a different name, and we chose Lake Quincy Media just because we had bought a house literally the day before I reported for duty for the Iraq deployment that was on a lake called Lake Quincy. So
very creative.
Yeah.
That's funny. But you ended up selling Lake Quincy Media and a second company, is that correct?
Yeah, so we've had a few exits or successful business sales. So we sold Lake Quincy Media a few years after we incorporated it to the Code Project.
Nice.
And I went to work for the Code Project for a couple of years as part of that deal. They're great guys up in Toronto, and they had a really kick-butt sales team. And that was one area that we had always struggled. Michelle and I had pretty much done all the sales, and we tried to hire a few salespeople, and none of them had worked out. So it seemed like a good match that they already had a good sales team. And while I was doing that, we started a consulting company as a means to scale. Actually, I guess back up a little bit. It was before we sold it that we started the consulting company, like a year before we sold it. And the reason we started a consulting company is because I was doing a lot of conference speaking. And at the end of my sessions, I would almost always have one or two people come up to me afterward and say, hey, that was really interesting. We need some help on our project. Are you available? And I would say, no, I don't really do that. I've got this ad company. Do you want to show some banners to a bunch of programmers? And they would say no. And so I felt like I was leaving money on the table.
Sure.
And at the same time, our development staff, which was like two guys plus me, was all a cost center. And so if we wanted to add another developer, it was just another, bunch of expense on that side of the ledger book. So we figured that if we had a consulting company, we could have Lake Quincy Media be the first customer of this consulting company. And all our developers would just now be consultants, and they would work for Lake Quincy Media when they didn't have other work. And if they had other work, then they would bill. And that would allow us to scale up our development staff. And that actually worked out quite well. And so we did grow our team, and we had probably 9 people, I think, when Lake Quincy Media was sold.
Wow.
And the only one that went with the sale was me. And so the other 8 people were all part of the consulting company, which was called NimblePros. And so once again, it was Michelle running that business while I was doing stuff with the Code Project for a couple of years with Lake Quincy Media.
Nice.
And right around the time that I finished up my tour of duty with the Code Project, and it was time for us to part ways, and it was all amicable, and they're great, and we still stay in touch. We were talking to one of our customers about being acquired with NimblePros, and that was Telerik. And so I was done with the Code Project and back working for NimblePros for probably 2 months before the Telerik acquisition was finalized, and then I was working at Telerik. So we kind of did back-to-back businesses that we sold.
Well, that's exciting. And do you is it something that is the nature of the way you work? Do you think that in your future is a third or a fourth one of these guys?
I expect that will be the case, yes. But for now, we've made a decision, my wife and I, that we are not going to focus so much on business and money as on quality of life and free time. We have 2 kids now, and they have a lot of activities. And Michelle, actually, we've been trying to have kids for quite some time, and she is now expecting twins in a couple of months.
Wow.
So we'll be pretty busy. Yeah. So after after the Telerik part of my career ended for both of us, because we both worked at Telerik for 2 years, I went to work for Falafel, where I'm now the chief technology officer, and we have a great team, and it's consulting, and I love that kind of work. But Michelle is perfectly happy not having a full-time job, and she's still active on some nonprofit boards that she's participating in. But she has more time now to focus on other things, including dealing with our soon-to-be larger family. So
that's wonderful. That's exciting, because the whole trying to balance, quality of life versus going after, every dollar on the table, I think is a challenge for most people in our industry.
Yes,
absolutely.
And it's hard for us too. I mean, we have years and years of habit of saying, "Oh, look, opportunity! We could make some money here. Let's go," and having to catch ourselves. So
yeah, it becomes habit forming. So yeah. I'd like to end the conversation by asking a question, and that is, if there's any sort of technical decisions or business decisions that you look back on and you wish you had, turned left instead of turned right or something like that. Do you have anything you think would have made a big change in the direction of your career?
There's a few things, nothing huge. I think overall I'm pretty happy, and I don't have too many regrets of the way things worked out. But one thing that ultimately I didn't waste a lot of time on was right around Silverlight 2, Silverlight 3 timeframe. I was getting ready to do a Silverlight book with a couple other people at NimblePros, and we ended up being so busy with billable work that it just wasn't going to happen, and we had to tell the publisher that we were going to drop it. And in hindsight, I'm very pleased with that, because Silverlight ultimately didn't have a long-term future, and so any additional investment in time that we would have put into that, we wouldn't have seen a lot of benefit from.
Yeah.
The other one was back probably 6-7 years ago. I had learned about extreme programming fairly early in my career, and the benefits of testing and TDD and things like that. So I was using all those techniques to the best of my ability as I was writing the ad software for Lake Quincy Media. And we found that it was just getting harder and harder and harder to do, because my initial training on how to write software was the classic Microsoft approach of, you have a UI that calls a business layer, that calls a data layer, that calls a database, and no notion of interfaces or dependency injection. And so everything was tested through the database, and that just got painful. And it wasn't until, fairly late, well, I guess looking back, it's not that late, but at the time it was late in my career, because it was that moment that I learned about this dependency injection, and that really just totally changed how I wrote software from that point forward. And so I do wish that I had learned that early on in my career, and I wish that were something taught more commonly in the college curriculum, is how to write code that's low coupling, and the dependencies can be teased apart so that you can test things, or you can modularly swap something out and replace it with something else using just an interface or what have you, and avoiding lots of globals and statics, and instantiating things right in line in a method, and coupling things together. So a lot of the stuff that I teach through my blog or through my Pluralsight courses is related to these concepts, because they were so radically changing how I wrote my software once I was introduced to them, and I had this aha moment of, okay, now I see how I can test my code and really do this right. So
yeah, sort of the architectural part of the problem that I think a lot of people early in their career are so focused on, solving the algorithm, that they forget that it's on top of this, in some cases behemoth amount of code that all has to magically work together. And until you start to, separate those things into these concrete pieces, you don't understand, how the house is standing up if you have, plumbing and electricity going in the same hall, as it were.
Right.
I think that's really good advice. Well, thanks for being on the show. This has been just great.
Yeah, I'm glad we managed to connect.
Yeah, finally. Well, you have a good day there, and I'm sure we'll see each other soon.
All right. Thanks, Sean.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Hello World podcast. Remember, you can